One of my favorite thinkers, one of the people who I imagine myself reading and studying and probably writing about and talking about the rest of my life, is Aristotle. And in a way, I came to Aristotle a bit late in my career, if you understand your career in terms of your philosophical formation. I've been working on Aristotle more or less nonstop and teaching Aristotle more or less nonstop since my graduate school days. But I didn't get into him until I was a graduate student. I'll talk about that in a moment. You can't say that I went through an Aristotelian phase because I never got captivated with Aristotle the way I did with, say, Nietzsche or Sartre or Hegel, where I was, trying to see everything through the lens of them. But Aristotle grew on me more and more, and although I would not call myself an Aristotelian in the sense of, subscribing to everything that that he teaches in his ethics and in his metaphysics, broadly understood, I would say that I am very influenced by Aristotle in many respects. There's some things that I think he got definitively right, and some insights that he had that unless you have those insights, I'm going to turn to Aristotle to get those, because I think they're so important. And I'll talk about those in a few minutes as well. So, how did I get into Aristotle? Like I said, it didn't happen until I was in grad school, and it didn't happen right away in grad school either. When I was an undergraduate, we had to read Aristotle, and we had that anthology, I think by Kahn, Classics of Western Philosophy, and it had the Nicomachean Ethics in it, and I think a few portions of the Politics, and some of the logical works, including the Categories. And I was assigned the Categories, and that was the first book of Aristotle I ever encountered, and I read through it, and I was like, what the hell is this? Why am I reading this sort of stuff? Because, what seemed right in it seemed just very commonsensical, and then there was all this stuff that just didn't make sense about being in a subject or being predicated of a subject, and my instructors really didn't do much of a job in explaining it. I think in part because they were not very interested in Aristotle themselves. They were very into existentialism and more contemporary stuff, and I don't think they really liked Aristotle. So when I got to graduate school, of course I had to start reading Aristotle for my master's exams, and that was only one exam, but it was pretty tough. You had to answer one question out of a pool of 3 on ancient philosophy, one on a pool of 3 on medieval, one out of 3 on modern, and then one on 19th century. And so, of course, I had to prep by studying some Aristotle. I ended up answering a Plato question, and interestingly enough, not an Aristotle question. And even then, I was not particularly interested in Aristotle, but I had a friend who was very interested in him. And this friend of mine was learning Greek, and he said, when you can read Aristotle in Greek, it's going to make all the difference in the world. And I've talked about this a little bit in the video that I have on languages. I did, in fact, learn classical Greek, and I learned it in part so I could read people like Plato. But then Aristotle was somebody who I started reading, in part to work on my Greek, and in part because I found more and more enjoyment and benefit in doing so. And so there were really a bunch of things converging about halfway through my graduate school career. And so I learned Greek. One of the things that you have to do when you're learning a language after you've learned the grammar and you've done some composition stuff is actually start reading authors and texts in the language, and that means you have to learn the lexicon, you have to learn the way they put things together. And so generally you'll do readings classes, and so I did a semester reading class, for example, on Plato's Symposium with one guy. I did one on Herodotus' history with another person. Well, I decided I wanted to work on Aristotle some, so I thought, well, I'll read the Nicomachean Ethics and I'll do it in Greek. So that's what we did one semester. I worked with this guy, Johnson, I think Doug Johnson was maybe his name. And he liked Aristotle, and so we read the Nicomachean Ethics in Greek, and each week we'd meet and go over it. And he was not a philosopher by training; he was a classicist. So he said, "Well, I'm going to let you handle figuring out whether this is philosophically adequate or enough." And another thing that we did that was very interesting is we also looked at translations, but we looked not only at English translations but also at French translations. And a few, every once in a while, German translations, just to see how they would render certain passages. And what was really fascinating to find out was that at least the French translations that I had, they were very paraphrastic compared to the English translations, which tended to be a bit more sticking to the literal text. So there was that, and then I began reading Aristotle also for the preliminary examinations at the school that I went to. Back then, we had 4 preliminary examinations that you had to take before you got to start writing your dissertation. And each one of these was the equivalent of the master's exam that you'd taken. So you had to answer 4 questions out of a pool of questions. And generally, you would take a lot of time to prepare because the reading lists were very extensive. And they included a lot of Aristotle because there was, metaphysics and philosophy of religion, so the metaphysics part, a lot of Aristotle in that. Epistemology and philosophy of science, so all of Aristotle's logical works were in there. And the De Anima, of course. And then what were called value fields, which included politics, aesthetics, and ethics. Well, guess what? Aristotle had something to say about all of those and actually wrote works on all of them. So I didn't read the entire Aristotelian corpus, but I read a good portion of it, or reread it in a lot of respects. And I was reading very attentively because I had to be able to reproduce this in a sort of synthetic, comprehensive form on the examination, making sense out of things. That was a really good practice. I'm all for making people take examinations like that and do the studying for it because I found it really helpful. It gave me this reservoir of knowledge that I could draw upon later, and it also introduced me to, by forcing me to read and reread and study Aristotle, it led me down the paths by which I could actually see what he was driving at. I'm a little dense, and sometimes it takes me, more than one time or 10 times to figure out what's going on in a text. And that process of having to focus and focus and focus, eventually sort of vistas opened up for me, and I started, oh, that's what this is about. Another thing that happened too was I was taking courses outside of the philosophy department, not just with classics, but also with the English department. I was taking classes on rhetoric, and I was taking classes over in speech communications having to do with semiotics. As it turns out, Aristotle's thought on language fits into both of these, and we in fact spent a good portion of time studying Aristotle's rhetoric. Also, Plato's Phaedrus and Gorgias, and some of Cicero's works, in order to make sense out of how we ought to use language. And so, unlike a lot of philosophers, I actually have a great respect for the rhetoric and also for the poetics, which is an unfinished work, but I think is very important. And that leads me to the next thing. One of the things that happened for me was when I was able to read Aristotle in the Greek, I started to see that there were connections in his work at the lexical level in terms of the terminology and the concepts that he was using that were, you might say, overlooked or broken in the acts of translation. And why is this? Well, you'll have a bunch of different translators of the Nicomachean Ethics over here, and they try to frame things as best they can in English to make sense of it for a contemporary audience. And then somebody else is translating the politics over here, and the same word, the same term that's being used, which might not be used in the same way, by the way, too. Aristotle would sometimes use the same word, but in multiple senses. But in any case, the same term may get translated in a very different way, and you don't see the connection between these two discussions, sometimes even within the same work. You don't see the connections going on there, that Aristotle is actually discussing the same sort of thing, unless you can read the Greek, or you have a great translation or a concordance or something like that. Well, anyway, I was reading Aristotle in the Greek, certainly the two ethics and the politics, the rhetoric, and then dabbling in the poetics and the topics and the de anima. And I started seeing all these different important connections between things, between different discussions. And it makes good sense because it's the same guy writing all this stuff. And Aristotle was a very comprehensive, systematic kind of thinker. So it does stand to reason that there would actually be connections between the discussions in these different texts. But a lot of people don't see them and don't draw on them. So their understanding of Aristotle tends to be a bit more truncated and not to incorporate all this other stuff that would give you a richer picture. So I was seeing that richer picture. And that by itself drew me in and made this into a mode of thought and a body of work that I wanted to keep working on and working on and working on, because it opened up more and more interesting topics and questions, more than I can probably explore in my entire lifetime. So that's how I got into Aristotle. And then I started writing papers on Aristotle, and some of them were presented at conferences. A few of them have been published here and there. I think I've published about 4 or 5 things on Aristotle so far. And eventually I decided I wanted to start writing a book on Aristotle and his discussions of anger, bringing all these threads that I see in about, 9 or 10 different texts, all of them together and talking about it as a systematic theory as best as one can, and then comparing it to other people's discussions and theories and treatments of anger. I'm also very interested in Aristotle's conception of shared common goods and political life and culture and moral perception, and so I do some writing on those sorts of things. I'm very interested in Aristotle's metaphysical scheme as well, although I don't necessarily buy into all of it the way that somebody who calls himself a neo-Aristotelian might do. But I think that he came up with some really useful ways to understand a lot of key things. And I think that if he had a few more tools in his belt, if he had come on the scene a bit later, his works might have been yet even more powerful in incorporating a lot of things. So Aristotle is an important thinker, and there's something, he's a respectable thinker to focus on anyway. If you're in philosophy and somebody says, well, what kind of stuff do you do? It's always a safe bet to say, I'm an Aristotle scholar, because everybody knows who he is, and even if they don't like Aristotle, at least you know as part of the canon, and you're doing some sort of reputable business. That's different than saying something like, well, I'm a Lacan scholar, which may not go over too well in many circles, or I'm interested in Maurice Blondel, and then everyone says, Maurice who? Or, St. Anselm scholar, everyone thinks that you work on the ontological argument all the time. Why is Aristotle such an important figure? Well, we have this kind of conception now of the history of philosophy as all these periods and all these thinkers, and they're sort of like canonical figures, like Socrates, Plato, Aristotle. Moving forward, Epictetus, Seneca, Epicurus, of course, a little bit earlier, Sextus Empiricus, Cicero. Move forward all the way to the present, and then it gets a little bit more confused. Well, who counts as a canonical figure? Wittgenstein definitely, but what about Carnap? Or who counts in continental philosophy? Definitely Heidegger, but what about Baudrillard? Yeah, those are interesting questions, but let's put that off. So Aristotle is now, sort of an established figure, but there were a lot of times where he was not studied, and I'm not just talking about during the early Middle Ages when he'd been lost. He wasn't completely lost, by the way, too. The medievals did know about him in part through glosses that were available. They lost a lot of his texts, and later on recovered them through the Islamic world and through these translations that were made available. But it's not as if he was completely off the scene. But he has been in and out of vogue. This is one of the really interesting things about Aristotle and Aristotelian philosophy. In some centuries, Aristotelianism was a dirty word. And it might actually be a good word and a dirty word at the same time. Like, during the 13th century reception of Aristotle in the universities, there were some people who were like, yeah, this is the best stuff. It wipes away everything. Other people were like, that's the devil, And then there were all sorts of things in between, including Thomas Aquinas, who had this very measured approach to Aristotle, trying to bring him in line with a Augustinian theological tradition as well, and incorporating lots of other sources, including John Damascene and Anselm and all these other great thinkers. If you move forward a little bit, Aristotle sometimes, like in the early medieval or the early modern period, there were these people that were teaching Aristotle as if Aristotle is, they were almost like fundamentalists of Aristotle. Well, Aristotle said it, it must be the case. And that, I think that was much more often just how it was taught, and not that they actually necessarily thought that. But that was the sort of rote learning at the time. And Descartes is reacting against that. Although Descartes is actually in many ways indebted to scholasticism, as Etienne Gilson has shown in his doctoral dissertation. Later on, because of the eclipse of a moribund scholasticism that Aristotle got identified with, there's a real lack of interest in Aristotle, for the most part, running throughout modern philosophy. And although they incorporated a lot of his ideas, a lot of his key terms and concepts, they were approaching them in different ways. There is one thing that needs to be said, is that there was this entire tradition, not so much in the German, English, French areas, but in other countries, particularly in Italy, of focusing on Aristotle's topics and poetics and rhetoric, and seeing those as essential to philosophy. Vico would be a great example of this. And then you move forward in time, and people start to recover an appreciation for Aristotle, and by the 20th century, some of the big heavy hitters are saying, yeah, Aristotle, he was a great metaphysician. He's made solid contributions in ethics. We may not actually accept his method, but there was something going on there. It wasn't just a bunch of dummies, the way that the early moderns often portrayed Aristotle. And so, what's really interesting is that there are periods where Aristotle is totally in vogue here, and then there are periods where it's like you don't hear about him at all. Read Hume, for example, and who do you see Hume talking about? The Stoics, the Epicureans, Plato, Cicero. Hardly anything about Aristotle, because, who would study that sort of thing? He talks about it a little bit, but not too much. My interest in Aristotle tends to be a bit more exclusive than the entire corpus. I have to admit, I'm not particularly interested in texts like the Physics or the Parts of Animals for their own sake. I'm much more, and I'm not that interested in the logical works per se, like the Analytics for their own sake. I'm primarily interested, I would say, in his human-centered, trying to make sense out of our common life, our moral life together, the moral distinctions that we make, our evaluations, how we develop, that sort of stuff. So I'm very interested in the two ethics, the politics, the rhetoric. I see all of those as sort of forming a cohesive whole together. Connected with them, of course, would be the topics, the poetics, the de anima, and parts of a few other works as well. The Constitution of Athens, which is really more of a history, but it tells us something about how these things play themselves out. Some of the problems actually fit in with that. Aristotle has these books called the Problems. I am also very interested in his metaphysical point of view, and that has to do in part with my interest in the human person, but also in his notion of being as such, actuality, potentiality, all these Aristotelian principles, privation, what actually constitutes privation. I think he gave us a very useful vocabulary and set of tools. He doesn't necessarily have the final answer on everything, but he set the agenda for a lot of research to take place, and he provided us with some very useful, at least problems, sometimes points of view, sometimes approaches to things. He's an interesting guy in part too, I would say, because he is a systematic thinker, but he never works things out fully systematically. He always leaves all these gaps where we have to kind of fill things in, and where we have to draw connections between the different texts, and where we have to say, well, how would Aristotle treat this sort of thing? And in part that's because of his method and his commitments. He thought that you couldn't determine everything with complete consistency across the board, that you had to develop what he called phronesis, the ability to actually figure out how to apply things in particular situations. And his philosophy is supposed to aid you in developing these sorts of things. So there is a good reason for that. I think it's also in large part, Aristotle was a dialectical thinker, so he's engaging with the best thought and explanations and ideas of his own time, and a lot has happened since then that Aristotle probably could make sense out of, and you can try to think out of it in an Aristotelian perspective, but he didn't think that out, because he's early on in the history of philosophy. I think that this is one of the things that really attracts me to Aristotle, is that his works sort of beg for incorporation with other modes of thought. There are people who want to be Aristotelians in the sense that, Aristotle had all the answers, and we just go to him and reconstitute things, and if he doesn't have something to say about it himself, we use his text to try to come up with a pure Aristotelian answer. And I've never found that very interesting. It's kind of again, to use a term in a pejorative sense that it doesn't necessarily have to have, a very scholastic exercise to do that sort of thing. I'm interested in Aristotle, in part because I see his way of approaching things as compatible with, although sometimes in tension with and requiring thinking out quite a bit, with other things that I'm interested in, like phenomenology, psychoanalysis, Christian theology, and Christian philosophy, our experience of moral life and failure and evil and breakdowns and all that sort of stuff. Aristotle gives me, and I think he gives a lot of other people, the framework, not necessarily to solve everything, but to make sense and to figure out where to go and what resources to bring to bear on the problems that we're faced with. And so I see a lot of compatibility that I think a lot of other people don't see between Aristotle's texts and ideas and his fundamental point of view and these other very interesting and valuable movements in philosophy, theology, social thought, history, all those sorts of things. So I would say Aristotle greatly enriches my own life of the mind, and I know that he does with other people too, because I see other people who are as excited about Aristotle as I am. So I'm going to close actually by pointing out two things that I think would be kind of useful for, if you're interested in Aristotle, to get your hands on. And one is this, massive tome, The Basic Works of Aristotle. McCann is the editor of it. And it's translations by different people. And it's got pretty much everything that you're going to want to read through with the Aristotle. It also has the lines, which is nice if you actually want to reference it, or if somebody else is referencing it and they say, yeah, it's 1058b15. Okay, you can actually figure out what they're talking about. So this is nice. It's got all the main works in translation in one handy volume. Can't ever beat that. Unless you, of course, go to the Greek. This is a Loeb Classic Series edition that has the second half of the Metaphysics, the Economics, and the perhaps pseudo-Aristotelian work, Magna Moralia. I tend to think of it as being pseudo-Aristotelian, but I'm not a textual scholar in that way. I do have a colleague who believes, and I want to see his argument for this, that it is, in fact, a genuine work of Aristotle. And these are nice in part because you get the English on one side and the Greek text on the other side. So I still use these today in part because sometimes I'll be reading the Greek and it's obscure, and I'll say, well, what's going on? I'll go to the English translation, and the translation may be helpful, or may actually lead me sometimes to say, well, why did he translate it that way? But in any case, it's kind of nice to have. It's a good size, and these are great books to have. I wish I had a lot more of these. As a matter of fact, someday my goal is to have like an entire bookshelf just of Loeb Classic editions of the different authors who I work with and love. And of the Loeb editions that I have, I would say that a good on the Greek shelf, a good half of them are actually Aristotle. Believe it or not, the author with the second largest representation, Lucian of Samosata, a satirical author who I just happen to like reading. But then there's Epictetus and Hesiod and people like that. But the bulk of it is Aristotle. So this gives you an idea about somebody who's very important to me, and I think is going to be important for the rest of my life and career, and somebody who I think is always worth spending the time to read and study. I love teaching him. I've seen students' eyes open up and the light bulb go on. I haven't seen the light bulb inside their head, but you understand what I'm saying. I've seen them make so many useful connections in reading works of Aristotle. Maybe more than with any other philosopher, but I do teach a lot of Aristotle, so I think that's part of it.